Good morning, I'm Carlos Romero, and I'm from Apex Evaluation. We're an evaluation firm that's been here in New Mexico since 1999. So it's been a minute. And before that, I spent 5 years at Highland University. And before that, I started evaluation as an undergraduate at UNM at the Evaluation Assistance Center for Bilingual Education. So I've literally been doing evaluation since I was a teenager. It's all I've ever done other than deliver pizzas. And so I'm happy to talk to you about my experience, my positionality. I think Audi revealed some positionality, and I'll do the same as we go. Starting with this idea of my title is executive producer. And why do I choose that? Because technically I'm the founder, I'm the president, and the CEO. All those things are true, but it's not really how I think about myself in doing this work. I'm really leaning into this idea that evaluation is fundamentally a storytelling endeavor, right? Our job is to tell more authentic, more compelling, more impactful stories. And I'm not even an evaluator anymore per se. Like, I don't have senior evaluator. We have lots of senior evaluators on our team. But my job is to orchestrate, right? I feel like I'm an evaluation entrepreneur, right? To orchestrate projects and teams and put people together. And so that's where the executive producer title comes in, if you needed an explanation. I also want to reveal some positionality by welcoming you to my hometown of Santa Fe. How many of you are native New Mexicans? Any native from Santa Fe? So really that's a big part of my positionality. And just around the corner is I was born at the old St. Vincent's Hospital. And I don't know how to say this in the words of Ron Burgundy, I'm kind of a big deal, right? If you know Ron Burgundy. Oh, hey, I didn't see Natalie here. But yeah, so what was the old St. Vincent's is now a tourist attraction, right? It's the Drury Inn. So if you see the Drury Inn around the corner, that used to be the old St. Vincent's Hospital. It's haunted, fair warning. I don't know if there's any correlation there. But more positionality, if you know the Santa Fe Hilton, which is also just around the corner, that's my old family compound. The Ortiz family on my grandmother's side settled the plaza in the 1600s. I'm not sure how we lost it to the Hiltons. But if you go there, the bar there is the Ortiz Bar and Restaurant, and that's my family, the Ortiz family. And another land acknowledgement, before it was the Ortiz compound, it was the Tanawan Pueblo. I don't brag about it as much these days, but another land acknowledgement. And I'm one of those, I'm a first generation college student. My mom was the second to oldest of 14. I'm the second to youngest of 7, and I was the first to graduate college. And I think I'm a story of sort of generational progress, right? I have 50 first cousins. I think we'd be a great case study of over the time, every generation, things get better, right? The trajectory has been upward. We're one of those New Mexican families, right? We're trying to make it, and we make it slowly. And another example of that is, so I have a degree from the University of New Mexico. I'm very proud of that. But I also have 2 other degrees from UCLA and from the University of Oregon. And when I say have, I mean I have the receipts. My daughters actually earned the degrees, so they hold the degrees, but I have the receipts. And by the receipts, I mean the student loan statements. But that's just a little bit about sort of I'll reveal more positionality as we go. But the topic today, and I want to announce a name change, right? In your agenda, it's called Systems Learning, an Equitable Evaluation Makeover. And I'm happy to talk about systems learning another time, right? I think there's some intention and hopefully some cleverness around why I'm calling it that. But I think for today's purposes, especially here we are at the market and we're in Santa Fe, really the point is, what would certified organic equitable evaluation look like, right? And so we'll play with that idea. So I invite you to be playful for that. And if you want to know about systems learning, Google it, look up at the website. Was there anything more about the positionality? Well, it'll come as we go. So what's, just a pulse of the room, what's our relationship to evaluation, right? How many of you are practicing evaluators? Is that like most of us? Probably, right? What are the other pieces? How many of you have participated as the subject of evaluation, right? You've had to hire an evaluator. You've been at the evaluation table somehow, right? So this is for everyone. But did you know that we have now identified all of the elements of evaluation down to has anyone seen the periodic table of evaluation? Some of you, I see, Kurt has seen it. So yeah, so if you're in the evaluation, you should know, thanks to the minds of Anna Vaca and Michael Quinn Patton, if you're in evaluation, you recognize Michael Quinn Patton as one of our ancestors probably at this point. And I was gonna bring some handouts, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. But if you're interested it's a really clever way to sort of group and sort and think about all the moves you can make in evaluation, right? So the periodic table, and we don't have to dive in and debate it, but let's give them credit and let the analogy sink in, right? All of evaluation, just like matter, if all of matter is some combination of the elements, all of evaluation is some combination of all these moves you can make, right? And today we want to talk about equitable evaluation. How many of you have heard of this thing called equitable evaluation? Also known as culturally responsive and equitable evaluation. So it's kind of a subset in the field of those of us, kind of as Audi alluded to, those of us who think evaluation could and should be in service of equity. And we think that because it hasn't always been in service of equity. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's one definition that I like from the Center for Evaluation Innovation. But if you're looking for things to Google Equitable Evaluation Initiative, the ACE Network, Expanding the Bench. There's lots of people, CREA, there's lots of different definitions. But fundamentally, equitable evaluation is about using evaluation as a tool for advancing equity. And it involves a diversity of teams, cultural appropriateness and validity of methods, revealing drivers of inequity, and empowering those most affected to shape and own how evaluation works. Right? Are we all in? Everyone in on that? One way or the other? And I want to talk a little bit about those. Who are those, right? Most effective. And here's the definition, because a lot of times we think about those of us who have positionality, it's easy to go to the demographics, right? And sort of say, hey, we check off a lot of boxes of demographics. But I like the way Edgar Villanueva talks about it in Decolonizing Wealth. He says those most excluded and exploited by today's broken system possess exactly the perspective and wisdom needed to fix it. So positionality, and that's how I define positionality, born of a deficit, right? We've been excluded and exploited, but now in our field it becomes an asset, right? And I think that those are the voices that should be leading the storytelling work of evaluation. And this requires activation, influence, and power in ways that the status quo doesn't yet support. So we need to think about, and I think about the business of evaluation. Remember I said I'm an evaluation entrepreneur? And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is how do we really think about evaluation as a business, a market of supply and demand. And so that's the question we have today is that I want to help answer is what does equitable evaluation actually look like? How do we do it? How do we know it's any good? And for this, I want to draw on an analogy and talk about what would certified equitable evaluation look like? Well, it's inspired by where we were with certified organic foods. How many of you are into organic foods? And I want you to think back to the early days. How many of you were into organic foods like in the early 90s, right? When it was just coming, maybe late 80s. How old are we? We're in Santa Fe, right? But if you remember, so within the market of foods, there was this sub-market of organic foods, right? And there was a supply and the demand was for something better, something more natural that didn't have preservatives and was less processed, right? And there was demand for that. And there was also a supply, right? It was more expensive, harder to find. I mean, I think now we're surrounded by, I think I passed by Whole Foods and Vitamin Cottage and Trader Joe's. It's everywhere. But at the time, it was harder to find, right? More expensive, it took longer. Maybe it wasn't even as sweet, right? We can dive into the different ways the analogy works. And there was a supply for this, right? But the demand was pure, but the supply needed regulation, right? Because people started slapping natural on everything. And we couldn't tell, is it natural, is it organic? So enter in certified organic foods. Now, how many of you know what goes into being certified organic? Right, we're in Santa Fe. But I didn't know, and you don't have to know, right? But you'll see the point, right? There's 5 things that if you're gonna be certified organic, you have to pay attention to soil health and regeneration, right? No extractive methods. Pest and weed control, no synthetic pesticides. Seeds and inputs, no GMOs, transparency in what you're doing. Land and animal stewardship, ethical treatment, ecological balance, And then the fifth thing is traceability, certification, and label integrity, right? There has to be transparency and accountability. And what do you get out of that? What was achieved is you got true market differentiation. Now we know what what certified organic means in the food, right? We have a common language and conventions. Most importantly, we have clear, universal, articulated, transparent, and enforceable standards. And that helps protect the consumers, the demand side, and it also protects the producers, right? And their value proposition, right, on the supply side. Now, I would argue that this is exactly where we are in equitable evaluation, right? Now, the difference is, though, I don't know that we have as much of a supply side problem like organic food has. It's almost the reverse, right? Because if you think about, here's a book that I'm proud to not be part of, but I'm friends with all these people, right? It's called Culturally Responsive Equitable Evaluation. I'll have it if you want to look at it later. But lots of stories of what this actually looks like in practice, right? People that are those early organic farmers of equitable evaluation. But the demand side, well, actually, maybe we do have a little bit of supply side because we also have big evaluation, right? You know how you have big pharma, big tobacco. We have big evaluation, right? And these are the huge industries. I mean, that we call them the big nine. I thought it was behind their back, but they actually came out with a statement saying, who are the big nine? But it's like Mathematica, Apt, Rand. These are the big institutions that are part of the entrenched status quo, right? So when we're trying to disrupt the field towards equity, they have a lot of power in the field that they're sort of like protecting themselves as the status quo. So I guess we do have a little bit of supply problem, but for those of us that are the smaller ones doing that work close to the soil, they have this organic thing, there's not a question about whether we're committed to it. But we have a demand side problem, right? We have lots of people, especially in philanthropy. I think philanthropy is a good example of there's a lot of talk, right? There's a lot of talk about saying evaluation should be in service of equity. But when it comes down to how they spend their money and where they spend their money, we have a demand side problem. But it's all solved by the idea of what would it mean if equitable evaluation actually meant something, what would that look like? And so that's what I want to go through today, is here's my version of certified equitable evaluation. And I want to talk about it in terms of results-based accountability, which sounds like it doesn't feel like it goes together. It's a problematic name, but how many of you are familiar with RBA, right? It was big in New Mexico state government, invented here in Santa Fe, right? Mark Freeman is one of the inventors. I hear he walks around wearing a Hawaiian t-shirt, or at least he used to. But so I want to give an RBA makeover. And if you know RBA, you'll recognize these things. And if you don't, it'll still be understandable, I hope. But so I want to talk about 5 things that are RBA attributes that really represent that life cycle, right? That represent all the different moves we can make, right? If you think of all the moves you can make, RBA kind of organizes them into a life cycle. But it needs a makeover. So I'm going to talk about 5 things: simple language, guiding questions, attribution versus contribution, story behind the data, and turning the curve. Those RBAers, do you recognize all those things? And then I want to say, what would an equity makeover be? And then I might draw from my positionality a little bit too, and give you an example from the work that we do with school-based health centers. That's the biggest part of our portfolio at Apex. I fell in love with school-based health centers early in my career for lots of reasons. One is that when I was growing up here in Santa Fe and then in Albuquerque, is we never had health insurance. And that was always a source of anxiety for me as a kid. And there were many times where it kind of came to be as there was the issue of what do we do? No health insurance, and yet we have health needs. And school-based health centers, if you go to a school in New Mexico, and there's 70 of them across the state now, and lots of hub and spoke with telehealth, but if you go to a school with a school-based health center, you have pretty good access to healthcare. And not just healthcare, but integrated healthcare, primary care, mental health, oral health. So I love school-based health centers. I also came out later in life. I've only been out for a little over 10 years. And so school-based health centers do a lot of work for kids that look like me, that are trying to get better information about what's going on, right, with them in terms of their sexual health, in terms of their identity. So I love school-based health centers. I'll give some examples for that as we go. So first, RBA talks about simple language. There's a premium on simple language on the premise that our jargon is too noisy. And this is the language trap that you see if you've ever been to an RBA training. you'll probably see something like this, right? Around we have too much, like what is an objective? How's that different from a benchmark? And then we add these modifiers to make them even noisier. And so I'm on a crusade to rehabilitate, maybe that wasn't the right word. Language does get crazy. Not on a crusade. But I want to rehabilitate jargon in the same way that we should rehabilitate cholesterol, right? Because a lot of times we say, don't use jargon. And I think that's wrong because we need to use some language for those of us that are in on it. Because jargon is like, if you're in on it, if you're an accountant, then that jargon means things. And if you're not an accountant, it can be noisy, right? So what is our jargon going to be so that if you're in on it, you're in on it? Oh, and I did have a slide to say we add to this when we talk about things like, well, what's equity? What is culturally responsive? Look at all the jargon that was in that definition. Validity of methods, diversity, positionality, wicked problems. And so the equity makeover here is that we do need simple language, and our jargon needs to be a signal for whoever's in on it. And an equitable evaluation, who's in on it, is like we're setting the evaluation table for 3 perspectives. And I think you alluded to it, right? Is sometimes evaluation is not for everyone. But an equitable evaluation, if you're in on it, which means do you have decision-making power? Are you doing the work in the field? Are you affected by the work? Those are the 3 perspectives that should be represented. And that's why a lot of times evaluators like us with positionality, we're really good at setting that table because we can represent some of those perspectives too, because they include us. Sorry, I got a little trigger happy. And so the whole point of simple language and making sure that everyone's in on is that we share a mental model. And I think we need to share 2 mental models. One is about the work itself, right? So if we're working with school-based health centers, and we can do a logic model, there's theories of change, there's lots of ways to share a mental model. But with school-based health centers, I think it's more on principle, right? School-based health centers are about an integrated model of care, right? That includes primary care, mental health, and oral health. But it's also about this idea of education, prevention, early intervention, referral for treatment. And it's about access to care, right? So that would be the mental model. If we were working with school-based health centers, we would all want to share, what is this thing about? And then what's the evaluation of it about is that mental model within a mental model. And we'll talk a little bit, next is going to be evaluation questions and evidence, but somehow that mental model has to point to a body of evidence that we're going to gather to know, is this working? How is it working? What could we do better? So the second thing about RBA, I think it's time to put the prop down. If I say periodic table, you'll know what I meant. So RBA also talks about 3 guiding questions, which I like. How much are you doing? How well are you doing? Is anyone better off? Right? And that feels like a good balance of process, quality, outcome. But the equity makeover is, for each of those questions, we should be saying, well, says who? Right? And the says who are those 3 perspectives we set. And it's especially important for that last question, is anyone better off? Says who? Right? And with school-based health centers, a lot of times we feel the pressure for academic outcomes, right? We're inside of these schools. We still live in a no child left behind type of mentality where we want to see, do graduations rates go up? Are people doing better academically? And that's not a bad question, but it's just not the only question, right? Because kids are better off when they get health care, right? And we know that that can contribute to those other things. So here's the 2-for-1 on this second one is RBA talks about the distinction between attribution and contribution, right? If we're evaluating school-based health centers, we know that they can increase access to health care and kids are better off for it. They also can contribute to these other things we care about, but being mindful of that distinction helps us make sure that we're not making school-based health centers only an academic intervention and then get disappointed. We didn't even talk about the RBA jargon of like population result versus programmatic indicator versus performance measure. I don't like their jargon. I feel it's noisy. But this is important around being realistic and making sure, hey, if we're talking about helping kids, then they and their families get to decide what it means to be better off. So that's the third one. The fourth one, and this is the biggest makeover, is RBA talks about the story behind the data, right? And almost as to say, hey, don't forget the story behind the data, because a lot of times we forget the story behind the data. But the RBA makeover here is that it's all story, right? The numbers are the story, the context is the story. Did I do that? Okay. So here's one of the mantras that I think is important, especially for evaluation, for equitable evaluation. I heard this at AEA over a decade ago. I don't know what the attribution is, but context gives meaning to data. Data without context is meaningless, right? And the context is the story. So it's not just, don't forget the story behind the data. Recognize that it's all story, and the most important part of the story is the context, not the numbers. And so I'm going to do a few book drops here for you to make the point. Anyone heard about Counting from Deborah Stone? This is a great book if you want to know that numbers are always in service of an agenda, right? Numbers are part of the story. They're in service of an agenda. They're never neutral. She talks about the Dr. Seuss book, Red Fish, Blue Fish. Is that what it's called? Not as a counting book, but as a categorization book. Right? So anyway, so if you're interested in this idea that we need to dive into the numbers and treat them as such, right? Numbers are part of the story. Because I think it changes the way we think about credibility, right? And we'll talk about methods in just a minute. But a lot of times we think credible evidence, the credibility comes from the numbers, right? But in an equitable evaluation makeover, we think more of a court of law, right? The credibility comes from the witnesses and how close they were and what they have to say about what happened. Right? So it changes our thinking. And one of the problems we have when we rely too much on methods and numbers is what Daniel Kahneman talks about as fast thinking. Now, how many of you have heard of the thinking fast and slow? Another, I think, a must read if you're an evaluator in this space. Because a lot of times when we think about how data is used, there's lots of biases, right, that go unexposed, right? There's assumptions that go unchallenged. There's stories that don't get to be revealed because of our fast thinking, right? And so I think understanding that it's all story means that we scrutinize the numbers, we elevate perspective, and the last book I'll draw to you is David Epstein and his book Range, because he makes the case that the key to breakthroughs for wicked problems is diversity of perspectives, right? We have to look at this from lots of different angles. And that's another time where our positionality comes in. It's because those of us who have had to challenge the mental models of the world, where we've been on the wrong side of the wicked problems and then on the other side of the wicked problems, right? If we're talking about poverty and income inequality, health and education disparities, racism and discrimination, we've seen them up close and we're bringing this diversity of perspectives. We're setting an evaluation table which is mindful of even more perspectives. That's how we're going to see breakthroughs. So that's the whole story behind the data. Now, I want us to talk a little bit about methods, and I want to share with you this methods matching matrix that I was introduced to in 2007 by my frenemies, my systems thinking frenemies, Derek and Laura Cabrera from Cornell. And his contention is that we should choose our methods based on the condition of knowledge, and that the more we know, then the more sophisticated, in his terms, we can get, right? And the premise here is that we shouldn't be dabbling in, RCTs until we know enough. Now, this always was troubling to me for a few reasons, is I don't know what the condition of knowledge is, right? How do we even assess that? And I also know that our marketplace values those things. So he would always say, hey, this isn't a hierarchy of value. But of course, but yes, it is. Because how many of us have seen the RFPs that say, we want an RCT, or at the very least, quasi-experimental. That's like the least we'll accept, right? So this is a hierarchy of how our economy works. And Darwin once said, ignorance more often leads to overconfidence than knowledge. So if we're in a market that says, hey, if you know a lot, you can start doing that, then that just feels like a recipe for disaster. So I went to work, I did a little improvement on this. And I thought, well, what if we flipped this scale and said, instead of thinking about condition of knowledge, let's think about learning needs, right? Are they high or low? And for wicked problems, hint, they're always high, right? We always need to learn more for wicked problems. And so if we flip that scale, we have to flip this scale. And if we flip this scale, now we have, I think, a more meaningful hierarchy of thinking fast and slow, right? And so I added listening, because Derek didn't have listening on his hierarchy, which is why he's my frenemy. And then I also added AI, right? I don't know a lot about AI, and I think that there's still lots to learn, but it feels like it's pretty fast thinking, right? And if the idea is like the faster the thinking, the more we need to be very careful about how it's factoring in. So now here we have something that is meaningful and that it allows for emergence. It's a hierarchy of emergence. It's a hierarchy of fast and slow thinking. And it's a hierarchy of whether or not positionality can come to be. So this is sort of, I think, a good guide, a good rule of thumb of all the moves you can make. And this is also, I think, what mixed methods looks like, right? A lot of times we say mixed methods and it becomes noisy jargon, but the reason we need mixed methods, because all of these things can be used, but we just have to be mindful of how we use them, right? So that's the fourth thing. It's all story. How do we choose methods? How do we think about scrutinizing numbers, elevating perspective? The fifth RBA makeover isn't really a makeover, but it's just a mindfulness of turning the curve implies that there's action involved, right? That we're looking at data, we're going to do something, we're going to look at data again. It also implies that iteration. And it implies a close relationship between evaluation and implementation. A lot of times evaluations, we come in, how many times have you come in and so much implementation is in the rearview mirror that you're always catching up, right? Or other times you're coming in, it's just getting started, implementation is so far on the horizon that it's like, what do we do while we wait? But the turning the curve says, hey, implementation and evaluation, that relationship has to be in sync. And this also implies turning the cycle of evolving those mental models, right? We should be changing the mental model of the work, and we should be changing the mental model of the evaluation. So I'm not sure if I'm over time, but that's it. What would certified organic equitable evaluation look like in RBA terms is jargon becomes signal, and we're sharing mental models. And when we ask questions, we always say, says who, informed by those three perspectives that are at the table, that it's all story, and that when we think about credibility of evidence and mixed methods and all the things, we should be sure that it's informed by those closest to the work, those credible witnesses that are bearing and their testimony. And that evaluation and implementation run in sync at the pace of implementation and the availability and quality of data. So if you want to know how do we make all these moves from everything we could do to get to this vision of equitable evaluation, this would be my version of that. And what do we achieve from that? The market differentiation, the common language, the enforceable standards, something that protects the consumers but also holds them accountable, and something that protects the producers but also gives us support so that we can collaborate and understand what it is better. So, for your consideration, I think next I'm passing on to Lindsay, and she's going to talk about how we use data, making data meaningful. I'll let her reveal hers. But thank you for your time. We'll talk later.